This is my true story. Every Christmas morning, my wife left the house before sunrise, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. She said it was her yearly tradition, a visit to an old friend's grave. I never questioned it. We'd been married for over 30 years, and I thought I knew everything about her. But last winter, something about the way she rushed out made me follow her. What I found that day at the cemetery changed everything I believed about our marriage, my best friend, and the truth buried under the snow. Before I tell you, comment where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. Every Christmas morning, my wife followed the same pattern. She'd wake up early, even before the sun touched the snow outside our window. She'd dress in her thick gray coat, wrap the red scarf I bought her years ago, and leave the house quietly. No breakfast, no coffee, no conversation. She always carried the same bouquet, red and white roses, wrapped neatly in thin green paper with a small silver ribbon. I thought it was a nice thing she did, respectful, kind, sentimental. She told me it was for an old friend, someone from before we met. I never asked who. I never wanted to seem jealous or suspicious. We lived in Wisconsin, the kind of place where winters felt like they lasted a lifetime. Snow piled up on the driveways, and the cold burned through your gloves if you stayed out too long. But no matter how bad the weather got, she never skipped her trip. Christmas morning was her day to visit the past, as she called it. I'd stay home, make coffee, and turn on the TV. There was always a Packers game rerun playing. The smell of pine from the tree filled the living room, and the sound of the game filled the silence she left behind. It became part of our rhythm, her visit, my coffee, and a quiet Christmas morning alone. I'd see her car disappear down the road every year, tires crunching through the snow, and I'd tell myself it was fine. Marriage, I thought, is built on trust. People have their rituals, their memories, their ways of honoring things. Maybe it was someone from her family, maybe a neighbor, maybe a friend from before I came along. I didn't pry. I told myself that love means not needing to know everything. She always came back around noon. Her cheeks would be red from the cold, and her hands slightly blue from holding the flowers. I'd ask if she wanted lunch, but she'd usually shake her head and say she wasn't hungry. Then she'd go straight to our room, close the door, and stay quiet for an hour or two. Sometimes I'd hear her sniffle, but I never said anything. I figured everyone grieves differently. That went on for 20 years. 20 Christmas mornings where she drove off with flowers and came back with silence. It became so normal that I barely thought about it anymore. The years blurred together. Snow, car, roses, quiet. Even when we moved houses, she found a new route to that same cemetery. It was as if the ritual mattered more than the day itself. But there were little things I began to notice as time went on, like how she always bought the same exact kind of roses, from the same florist across town, even when it meant driving twice as far. Or how she'd start looking uneasy whenever December came around, pacing near the window like she was waiting for something. She never wanted me to come along, not even once. I remember offering one year, just trying to be kind, and she got defensive, said it was personal. That word stuck in my head for a long time. Personal. I'd ask who she was visiting, and she'd always keep it vague. An old friend. Someone important. You wouldn't know him. Him. She said him once, and I remember how she caught herself and changed it to them. I brushed it off, but something about it bothered me. Still, I let it go. You don't question your wife on Christmas. Our neighbors probably thought it was sweet, a woman bringing flowers to a grave every year without fail. They'd wave when she drove off, like she was doing something noble. And maybe she was. Maybe it really was just a friend she respected. I told myself that story every year to keep things simple. But deep down, I knew something didn't add up. 20 years is a long time to cry over a friend. Every December, the same flowers, the same grave, the same look in her eyes when she returned. That wasn't just grief. That was connection. The kind you don't bury easily. Still, I stayed silent. Because silence was easier than the truth. For 20 years, that same pattern repeated without change. She'd wake up early on Christmas morning, leave the house with her bouquet, and come back just before lunch. It was predictable, almost mechanical. I'd gotten used to it, the same way you get used to an old creak in the floor or the sound of the furnace kicking on. At first, I saw it as a good thing, proof that she cared about people, that she had compassion. She never missed a single Christmas, not even when she was sick with the flu one year. She said, "It wouldn't feel right to skip." And I believed her. I never went with her. She always said it was something she needed to do alone. I respected that, or maybe I just didn't want to interfere. That's what long marriages sometimes turn into. Routines you stop questioning. I'd make coffee, fix breakfast, and wait for the sound of the garage door to open again. I'd even warm up soup for her before she got back. It became part of our unspoken agreement. I didn't ask questions, and she didn't offer answers. After a few years, I started to notice small things that didn't sit right, but I brushed them away. She'd come home quiet, always quieter than before she left. Her eyes would be red, and she'd say the cold made them water. She'd head straight to our bedroom and sit there with the door shut for an hour or two. Sometimes I'd hear the floor creak as she paced. Other times, I'd hear nothing at all. It wasn't the kind of silence that brings peace. It was the kind that fills the air when someone's carrying something too heavy to say. She kept a small wooden box on her dresser. Inside it, I once saw a few dried rose petals and a folded note, yellowed at the edges. I assumed it was from one of her relatives, maybe her parents, maybe someone from school. She never talked much about her past, and I didn't push it. You learn to live with pieces of someone you don't fully understand. It's easier that way. Every December, she grew more tense. Her mood changed as soon as the first snow fell. She became distant, quiet, almost like she was counting down the days until that visit. I'd try to lighten the mood by putting up decorations or playing Christmas music, but she'd just smile faintly and say she wasn't in the mood. Sometimes she'd sit by the window at night, looking out at nothing, her face blank. I remember once I asked if she was okay. She said, "Just thinking." That was all. Our friends noticed too. At parties, when people talked about their holiday plans, she'd go quiet. If someone mentioned visiting graves or lost family, she'd change the topic. Everyone thought she was just private. I thought so too. After all, we were both older now, and time makes you hold on to memories in different ways. But I couldn't ignore how personal it seemed. It wasn't the kind of sadness you have for a distant friend or a family acquaintance. It was deeper. It was like something inside her still lived in that graveyard. I remember one Christmas in particular, maybe 15 years into our marriage. It was snowing hard, heavy enough that most people stayed inside. I suggested she skip her visit, but she didn't even respond. She just grabbed her coat, scarf, and gloves and left anyway. Hours later, she came home soaked, shivering, and exhausted. Her hands were cut from brushing snow off something. I asked what happened. She said she slipped near the cemetery gate. I wanted to believe her. Over the years, I convinced myself it didn't matter. She was a good wife, kind, loyal, steady. Maybe that one strange tradition was her way of coping with something I didn't need to understand. I told myself that as long as she came home, everything was fine. But deep down, I knew that every time she walked out that door with flowers, she was walking towards something I wasn't part of. Something she'd never shared with me. Something that lived buried beneath snow, stone, and secrecy. Still, I stayed quiet. Because silence was easier than suspicion. Last Christmas was different. I couldn't explain why at first, but something in the air felt heavier that morning. Maybe it was because the snow had started early, covering everything in a thick layer before dawn. Maybe it was the way she moved, too fast, too nervous, like she was late for something important. Normally, she'd make coffee before leaving, maybe hum a little tune while putting on her coat. But that day, she didn't say a word. She just grabbed her purse, her gloves, and the bouquet she'd bought the night before. I watched her from the kitchen table, pretending to read the paper. She didn't even notice. The door closed behind her, and the house went quiet. I looked at the clock. 7:10 a.m. She'd never left that early before. Usually she waited until at least 9 after sunrise. I stared out the window as her car disappeared down the street. Something told me to follow. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't jealousy. It was curiosity mixed with unease. After 20 years of trust, one small shift in her behavior had cracked something in me. I put on my coat, grabbed my keys, and decided to drive after her, far enough back that she wouldn't see me. The roads were slippery from the fresh snow. The sky was still gray, and the cold was sharp enough to sting your hands through the gloves. I kept a few cars between us as we drove through town. She didn't stop for coffee like she usually did. She drove straight down Route 41, past the old gas station, toward the outskirts where the Maple Grove Cemetery sat behind a row of pine trees. My stomach turned when I realized where she was going. I had always assumed it was that cemetery, but seeing it confirmed hit me harder than I expected. I parked a block away and waited a few minutes before following her on foot. The snow crunched under my boots, and my breath came out in white clouds. I could see her from a distance, a small figure walking through the gates, the bouquet tucked under her arm. She moved slowly, careful with each step, as if she'd done this 1,000 times. I stayed behind the fence for a moment, watching. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from something else entirely. She walked past the older graves, the ones from the early 1900s, and made her way toward the veterans section near the back. I knew that part well. My best friend, Tom Jacobs, had been buried there after the Army confirmed his death back in the 70s. We'd served together. We'd grown up together. He was more like a brother than a friend. I hadn't visited his grave in years, mostly because it hurt too much. Seeing her walking in that direction made my chest tighten. At first, I told myself it couldn't be his grave. There were plenty of soldiers buried there. But as she got closer to the old oak tree that stood near his plot, I knew. My legs felt weak. She stopped at Tom's grave, his grave, knelt down, brushed snow off the headstone, and laid the flowers gently across his name. She stayed there for a while, not moving, not looking around, just staring at the stone like she was waiting for it to speak back. I stood behind a row of monuments, half hidden by a marble angel, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My wife, my partner for decades, at the grave of the man who had once been my best friend. The man I had mourned like a brother. The man she had never once mentioned since the day of his funeral. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of her whispering. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her shoulders tremble. She wiped her face with her gloved hand and kissed her fingers before touching the headstone. Then she stood up, took one last look, and walked back toward the car. I didn't follow her home right away. I stayed there, staring at Tom's name in the snow, my breath shaking in the air. That was the first time I realized something had been buried deeper than him. I waited until she drove away before stepping closer. The cemetery was empty except for a few crows and the sound of snow sliding off tree branches. My boots sank into the slush as I walked toward the veterans section. Each grave was marked with the same small flag and bronze plaque, lined neatly in rows. I had been there before, years ago, when they buried him with full honors, but I never went back after that. It was too hard to see his name carved into the stone. We'd been inseparable once, went fishing together, built our first cars together, joined the Army on the same day. He didn't come home. I did. For decades that fact weighed on me. When I reached the oak tree, I stopped. Her bouquet lay neatly across the base of Tom's grave, fresh red and white roses, still bright against the snow. The ribbon fluttered in the wind, the same silver one she used every year. My breath caught as I brushed the snow off the plaque. Thomas Edward Jacobs, born 1948, died 1974. Beloved son, friend, and hero. The cold didn't bother me. What did was the sight of my wife's handwriting on a small tag tied to the stems. Always. Just one word. Always. Not a message of friendship, not a family note, just always. It hit me like a punch to the chest. For a long time, I stood there, staring at that grave. The memories flooded back. How Tom used to come over for dinner, how she'd laugh at his jokes more than mine, how he always offered to help around the house when I was working late. I remembered the way they'd talk in the kitchen when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Back then, I thought it was harmless. We were all close. We shared everything: time, food, laughter, stories. But now, standing at his grave, I saw it differently. I knelt down and pressed my glove into the snow, tracing the edges of his name. My breath fogged the air in front of me. My best friend. My wife's secret. The realization hit slow, like ice spreading under the skin. 20 years of her visits. 20 Christmas mornings. Every one of them she came here, not to honor a fallen friend, but to mourn something I was never part of. The anger didn't come right away. It started as disbelief, then confusion, then a hollow feeling in my chest. I tried to come up with reasons. Maybe he had written her before he died. Maybe she was honoring a promise. But none of those excuses fit the way she acted. The way she'd come home quiet and red-eyed. The way she'd touch that wooden box on her dresser and smile sadly. As I stood there, the snow began to fall again, soft and heavy. I watched it cover the roses she'd just placed. Within minutes, the flowers disappeared under white, just like the years had buried whatever truth lived between them. A memory came back, one I hadn't thought about in decades. The day before Tom shipped out, we'd all had dinner together. He pulled me aside that night and said, "Take care of her if something happens to me." I laughed and told him not to talk like that. Now I wondered what he really meant. I looked around the cemetery, half expecting to see her car parked somewhere still, but she was gone. Just me, Tom, and 25 years of unanswered questions. I bent down, brushed off the rest of the snow, and stood quietly for a while. The wind moved through the trees, shaking loose flakes that landed on the fresh flowers. I thought about how many Christmas mornings she'd spent right there, while I was home drinking coffee, thinking she was doing something noble. She wasn't just leaving flowers, she was visiting the man who never truly left her heart. And now, every Christmas I had lived believing in peace, she had lived remembering a love I never knew existed. That grave didn't just hold my best friend. It held the truth she buried right alongside him. The flowers looked almost too perfect sitting there in the snow. Fresh red and white roses, the kind you only buy for someone you love. Not wilted, not random. Chosen carefully, wrapped neatly, arranged with care. I stared at them for a long time, realizing that every single Christmas bouquet I'd seen her carry out of the house over the years had ended up right here, right at Tom's grave. She hadn't just been keeping a promise, she'd been keeping a secret. I crouched down, brushing off the snow that had started to cover the roses. The tag tied to the stems still said, "Always." Her handwriting, neat, familiar. That single word said everything she never told me. It didn't belong to a widow honoring a friend. It belonged to a woman still in love with someone who wasn't her husband. That thought stayed in my chest, like a weight I couldn't shake off. I remembered how many times I'd seen her hands shaking slightly while she arranged those same kinds of flowers at home before leaving. I thought it was the cold. I thought it was habit. I didn't realize it was emotion. I didn't realize she had probably cried every Christmas morning, not because she missed family or memories, but because she missed him. The air was sharp enough to sting. I could hear the sound of my own breathing under the dull hum of the wind. I kept thinking about all those years I spent sitting on the couch, sipping coffee, waiting for her to come back. I'd imagined she was doing something kind, something selfless. Now, it all looked different. Every quiet return, every red eye, every excuse. She hadn't been mourning death. She'd been visiting the only man she'd truly loved. I leaned against the headstone, staring at the letters of his name, tracing them with my gloved fingers. It was like reading a confession that had been sitting there in plain sight for decades. Tom Jacobs, my best friend, the man I trusted most. The man who was supposed to be like family. The man whose ghost had been in my house all along. I thought back to the old days. How often Tom used to stop by our home before deployment. He'd always bring her small things. A scarf from the fair. A book she mentioned liking. I used to joke that he spoiled her more than I did. We all laughed. Maybe I should have paid more attention to who laughed the loudest. After he died, she was never quite the same. I thought it was grief for both of us. I told myself she just needed time. But it wasn't time she needed. It was closure she never got, because maybe she didn't lose a friend. Maybe she lost something deeper. Something forbidden. The snow started to pile on my shoulders, melting slowly against my coat. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. The whole cemetery was silent except for the sound of wind and the occasional flap of a flag. I knelt there longer than I should have, thinking about how easily we build our lives on things we assume are true. I tried to remember if Tom ever said anything before he left for the war. The night before his deployment, we'd all been together, the three of us. He'd asked me to take care of her if something happened to him. At the time, it sounded like a brother's request. Now it sounded like a lover's plea. When I finally stood up, I looked down at the flowers again, bright red against all that white. They looked too alive for a grave, too beautiful for what they represented. I took a step back and realized something. I wasn't angry at her yet. I was just hollow, empty, like a man reading the final page of a story he didn't know he was part of. I turned away from the grave, snow crunching beneath my boots, and started walking back to my car. But before I left, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The wind blew across the grave, and the roses shifted slightly, their petals brushing against the stone. It felt like the earth itself was confirming what I didn't want to believe. Every Christmas for 20 years, while I sat at home thinking she was honoring the past, she had been holding on to it instead. And the worst part, I had helped her do it year after year without even knowing. When she came home that afternoon, everything looked normal from the outside. The snow had started to slow, the house smelled like cinnamon candles, and she hung her coat by the door the same way she always did. I sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read the newspaper, my hands still trembling from the cold, or maybe from what I had seen. She smiled faintly, the same tired smile she gave me every Christmas after her visit. I nodded back, but something inside me was different now. I couldn't unsee what I saw. I couldn't unknow it. We ate lunch quietly. She didn't talk much, and I didn't push. The whole time, her phone kept buzzing on the counter, but she ignored it. I stared at her hands, noticing how her nails were still red from brushing snow off the grave. The silence between us felt thick. I wanted to believe there was an explanation. I wanted her to tell me the truth before I asked. But she didn't. So, after lunch, I finally said the words that had been sitting on my tongue since morning. Why him? That was all I said. Just those two words. Her fork froze mid-air. She didn't speak. For a moment she looked confused, or maybe she was pretending to be. Then her face changed. She realized I knew. Her shoulders dropped, and she put the fork down slowly. The room stayed quiet, except for the faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall. She didn't answer. Not right away. She just sat there staring at the table like the truth might be written there. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "You wouldn't understand," she said softly. But I did. I understood more than she thought. Because the moment she said those words, everything clicked. The years of silence. The red eyes every Christmas. The way she never wanted to talk about the past. The way she smiled whenever someone mentioned his name before quickly changing the subject. The truth was, sitting there in front of me, as plain as the snow outside. She hadn't been visiting a friend. She hadn't been grieving someone we both lost. She had been mourning the man she actually loved. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. There was no point. You can't argue with something that's already gone. You can't fight a memory. I just sat there, staring at her, realizing that our entire marriage had been built on something uneven, a foundation that started cracking the day he died. She reached across the table like she wanted to touch my hand, but I pulled away. Not out of anger, out of disbelief. Because now, every small detail I thought I understood about her felt like a lie. The candle on the counter flickered as the heater turned on. The sound of the vents filled the silence between us. I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to speak again. But I didn't. I didn't trust my voice. I just got up, took my coat, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap. For the first time in decades, I didn't know where to go. I walked down the street, past the mailbox, past the same snow-covered yards I'd seen every winter. But everything felt different now. The world looked colder, emptier. I thought about Tom, how we used to sit at the bar after work, talking about life, about dreams, about loyalty. He'd always tell me I was lucky to have her. I guess he wasn't lying. He probably meant it. I stood there for a while under the gray sky, watching the snow fall on the road. I tried to remember the last thing Tom ever said to me before he left for deployment. He'd patted me on the shoulder and said, "Take care of her if something happens to me." I thought it was a joke between brothers. Now I realized it was a message meant for her. When I came back inside, she was gone. Her coat, her purse, her car, all gone. I didn't stop her. I didn't call her. I didn't need to. I already had my answer. The truth didn't shout. It whispered. In the flowers, in the grave, in her silence. And that whisper was louder than any confession could ever be. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that presses down on you, makes you hear every clock tick and every creak in the floor. I sat in the living room for hours, staring at the family photos on the wall. Every smile in those pictures looked different now. Every holiday, every trip, every Christmas where she said she was visiting a friend. They all had another story hiding behind them. I tried to remember the early days of our marriage, before Tom died. They'd laugh together a lot back then. Sometimes I'd walk into the kitchen and find them mid-conversation, her eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen before. I told myself it was friendship. It was easier to believe that. When I couldn't stand sitting anymore, I went down to the basement. We kept old boxes down there, things from before we moved, from when life still felt simple. The air was cold and smelled like dust and wood. I switched on the small lamp near the workbench and started going through the boxes one by one. Photos, letters, decorations, papers from years long gone. I didn't know what I was looking for, but my hands wouldn't stop moving. Then I found it, a shoebox I hadn't seen before, tucked behind a stack of Christmas ornaments. It wasn't labeled, but when I opened it, I knew it was hers. Inside were old photos and a few folded letters, yellowed at the edges. I pulled one out and recognized Tom's handwriting instantly. I'd seen it before on birthday cards, on notes from when we worked on the car together. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. It wasn't long, just a few lines written before he left for deployment. "If anything happens to me, don't forget what we had. I'll carry it until my last breath." My chest tightened as I read it again. The date on the corner was from the week before he shipped out. She had kept that letter for over 40 years. I found 3 more just like it, written in the same tone, private, personal, filled with the kind of emotion that doesn't belong to friendship. Then came the photos. Most were harmless, the 3 of us together at a barbecue, at the lake, at a parade. But one photo stopped me cold. It was taken behind the old barn we used to visit during the summer. I remembered that day clearly. I had been fixing the truck. They must have slipped away while I was busy. In the photo, she was standing close to him, smiling the way she never smiled for me. And Tom's hand was holding hers. Not a friendly gesture, not casual. It was the kind of photo that told a whole story without needing words. I sat there for a long time, staring at that picture, the paper trembling slightly in my grip. My best friend, my wife, the 2 people I trusted most. I thought about all those years she spent mourning him while I sat beside her, never realizing she wasn't just grieving a friend. She was grieving the man she actually loved. It felt like betrayal layered under decades of normal life, the kind that hides behind good mornings and small talk. The box had other things too, an old bracelet I'd never seen, a folded note with his initials, and a pressed flower that had turned brown with age. Maybe from the first bouquet she ever brought to his grave. She'd kept it all. A secret museum built in a basement I never thought to search. I wanted to be angry, but what I felt was exhaustion. The kind that seeps into your bones and leaves you hollow. I didn't go upstairs right away. I just sat there at the workbench, staring at that single photo, thinking about how small decisions, a letter kept, a grave visited, could carry the weight of an entire hidden life. When I finally put the box away, I didn't throw it out. I couldn't. I just placed it back where I found it and turned off the light. As I climbed the stairs, the house felt heavier than before. The memories hanging on the walls weren't memories anymore. They were evidence. And in that moment, I realized something that hurt more than any lie ever could. She hadn't cheated on me after he died. She had cheated on me by never letting him go. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The bed beside me was cold and empty, just like it had been for years, only now I finally understood why. I sat there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of wind pushing against the windows. The snow from last night hadn't stopped. Everything outside was white, quiet, and endless. I got dressed, made coffee I didn't drink, and looked at the clock. It was 7 a.m., the same time she used to leave every Christmas morning. My hands moved before my mind did. I grabbed my coat, keys, and gloves and walked out the door. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't have to. The roads were slick and empty. The plows hadn't come through yet, so I drove slow. The town was still asleep. The same streets she had taken for 20 years rolled past my windshield. The grocery store, the gas station, the long curve near the church. Everything looked the same, except now I was the one behind the wheel. I didn't play music. I didn't need noise. All I could hear was the sound of the tires crunching over snow and the faint hum of the heater. My chest felt heavy, but my head was clear. I knew exactly where I was going. When I reached Maple Grove Cemetery, the gate was half buried in snow. I parked near the same oak tree where she used to park, stepped out, and felt the cold sting my face instantly. The air was sharp and dry, the kind of cold that burns when you breathe. I pulled my collar up and started walking toward the veterans section. My boots left deep prints behind me, the only ones on that side of the graveyard. The closer I got, the slower I walked. Part of me didn't want to see it again. That stone, those flowers, that name. But I had to. I needed to stand there, not as a husband following his wife's secret, but as a man reclaiming a piece of his own past. When I reached the grave, the flowers she'd left 2 days earlier were still there, half frozen under a thin sheet of ice. The red petals had darkened, and the ribbon was stiff from the cold. I crouched down and brushed the snow away, revealing his name again. Thomas Edward Jacobs, my best friend, my wife's secret, the man who had somehow lived between us all these years. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't bring anything. I just stood there, looking at the name, thinking about all the years I had spent trying to be the man she wanted, not realizing I was competing with someone buried in the ground. For a long time, I didn't move. The wind howled through the trees, and snowflakes clung to my coat. I thought about our time in the army, how Tom always had a way of talking people out of trouble, how he could charm anyone. He was loyal, brave, easy to like. Maybe that was why it hurt so much. I couldn't even hate him. I spoke quietly, not because I expected anyone to hear, but because the silence demanded it. I told him that I'd taken care of her like I promised, that she had a good life, comfortable, peaceful, full of everything we'd worked for. I told him she was gone now. And then I said the only thing I hadn't been able to say out loud since the moment I saw that grave. You had your piece of her. I'll take the rest of the years. The words came out steady, without anger, without hate, just truth. When I finished, I stood there for a while longer, staring at the headstone as the snow started falling again. Then I turned around and walked back to my car. My footprints led straight from his grave to the gate. No detours, no hesitation. For the first time in months, my steps felt light. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The cemetery faded into the distance, swallowed by snow. I didn't feel peace exactly, but I felt something close. A kind of quiet that comes when the past finally stops following you. That morning, I didn't go home right away. I stopped at the diner in town, ordered coffee, and sat by the window watching people go about their day. No one knew what had just ended. No one needed to. Some secrets die the moment you stop letting them live rent-free in your heart. And for the first time in decades, I let mine go. The years since that winter have been quiet, almost too quiet sometimes. The kind of quiet you don't fight anymore, the kind you learn to live with. She never came back after that Christmas. No calls, no letters, no explanations. I don't know where she went, and honestly, I never tried to find out. Some things don't need closure. Some things are better left where the truth buried them. At first, the house felt too big for one person. Every sound echoed. The refrigerator hum, the creak in the floor, the wind slipping through the window frames. I caught myself listening for her footsteps every morning, even though I knew they'd never come again. After a while, I made peace with it. I started fixing things she always said I'd get to later. I painted the porch, replaced the old light by the front door, and finally built the bookshelf I'd been meaning to make for years. The work gave me purpose, something to fill the hours that used to belong to her routines. I didn't touch the guest room for a long time. It still smelled faintly like her perfume. But one spring morning, I opened the windows, stripped the bed, and cleared everything out. I turned it into a small office, a place where I could sit, read, and think without memories staring back at me. Christmas still comes every year, whether you want it to or not. I stopped putting up a tree. I still hang the lights on the porch out of habit, but that's about it. On Christmas morning, instead of waiting for her to come home, I get in the truck and drive. Sometimes I go to the diner in town, sometimes just along the old highway that cuts through the snowfields. I don't stop at the cemetery anymore. I don't need to. The dead don't need flowers, and the living don't need reminders. The people in town know what happened, at least the version that made its way through whispers. Small towns don't keep secrets for long. They still greet me politely at the grocery store or nod when they see me at the post office. No one asks questions, and I don't offer answers. That's our unspoken agreement. Every once in a while, someone will mention Tom in passing, something about the old days, the army, the stories we used to tell, and I'll nod, maybe smile a little, but I never say his name out loud anymore. It feels like saying it keeps him alive, and I've had enough of ghosts. I spend most of my days in the workshop now. I fix old radios, clocks, small things that still tick when cared for. There's something peaceful about repairing what can be fixed, especially when so much in life can't be. I cook simple meals, go to bed early, and wake up to quiet mornings that no longer ache the way they used to. The loneliness never really leaves, but it stops hurting once you stop expecting company. Sometimes I still think about her, not with anger, but with confusion. I wonder if she ever thinks about me, if she still visits his grave somewhere else, in another town, with another name, or if she finally let him go the way I had to let them both go. I'll never know, and that's fine. The truth stopped mattering the day I accepted that the past doesn't owe us explanations. What matters now is the peace that followed. It's strange how peace doesn't come with happiness, it comes with acceptance. You stop asking why and start saying it happened, and that's enough. The snow still falls the same every December. The town still puts up lights, the church bells still ring, and families still gather. I watch from my porch with a cup of coffee in hand, bundled in an old coat, and I don't feel bitter anymore, just older, wiser, quieter. Every year, when Christmas morning comes, I whisper one small thing to myself before the day begins. No flowers. No graves, no ghosts. And then I live another day. Every Christmas, she said she was bringing flowers to a friend. I believed her because I wanted to. That's what marriage often is, believing the story that makes life easier to live. For 20 years, I watched her leave with those red and white roses, thinking it was grief that kept her going back. But now I know better. She wasn't mourning loss. She was keeping it alive. Every bouquet she laid on that grave wasn't an act of remembrance. It was an apology to the man she never stopped loving, and I was just the one standing beside her, too blind, too trusting, too loyal to see it. At first, that realization broke something in me. It felt like I'd been living someone else's story without knowing it. Every photo, every meal, every holiday we shared had a shadow standing between us. A man buried decades ago who still held part of her heart. The betrayal wasn't loud, it wasn't violent. It was quiet, patient, stretched across years like a slow leak that drained the life out of everything we built. You don't feel it happening until there's nothing left to fix. For a long time, I thought about what I could have done differently. Maybe if I had noticed sooner. Maybe if I had asked questions instead of staying silent. But then I realized, no matter what I did, She had already made her choice. Some people bury their secrets, and others visit them every year with flowers. She chose the second. I chose to pretend not to see it. In that way, maybe we both shared the blame. Now, years later, I don't carry anger anymore, just understanding. Life has a way of showing you the truth in slow motion. When you're young, you think betrayal looks like shouting, doors slamming, broken glass. But when you're older, you learn that it can look like a calm smile, a soft lie, and a person who kisses you goodnight while their heart is somewhere else. I've had time to think about Tom, too. My best friend. The man who probably didn't mean for things to happen the way they did. Maybe they fell in love before the war. Maybe it was a mistake that turned into a memory they could never bury. I'll never know. But I stopped hating him the day I realized hating him wouldn't change anything. The war took his life. The truth took my marriage. That's just how things ended for both of us. People ask sometimes if I ever remarried. I didn't. Once you've lived through something like that, you start valuing peace over company. The quiet doesn't judge you. The walls don't lie. The house doesn't keep secrets. And for the first time in decades, that's enough for me. Every now and then, I drive by the cemetery out of habit. I don't go inside. I don't need to see his name again. I just slow down when I reach the bend in the road, glance toward the oak tree, and keep driving. The snow covers everything now. The grass, the graves, the flowers she used to leave. Time has buried it all the same way it buried them. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means accepting that the past can't be rewritten, no matter how much you wish it could. She made her choices. I made mine. And in the end, I got something she never did. Peace. Not joy, not closure, just peace. If you asked me what I'd say to her now, I'd probably say nothing. Some answers don't deserve to be spoken out loud. But if I could whisper something to the man under that headstone, I'd tell him the truth. You had her heart. I had her years. We're even. Every Christmas, she brought him flowers. Every year, I waited for her to come home. Now there are no flowers, no waiting, no lies left between us. Just two lives that shared a house but not a story. And if there's one thing I've learned from it all, it's this. In the end, time buries everything. The love, the lies, and the people who thought they could keep them separate.